May 9, 1941. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. The message arrived at 04:17 hours, exactly 3 minutes after HMS Bulldog pulled a drowning German sailor from the North Atlantic. But it wasn't the rescue that mattered. It was what the sailor had been trying to destroy. In his frozen hands, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with wire, was a small wooden box. Inside that box sat the reason 400 men had just died in the icy water, an Enigma machine, model M3, serial number 1224, complete with its rotors and codebooks. The British destroyer had depth-charged U-110 until it surfaced like a wounded whale, and in the chaos of evacuation, the German crew had failed to complete their most sacred duty, to sink the machine that could lose them the war. Alan Turing stood in Hut 8, his hands trembling as he held the device for the first time. It was smaller than he'd imagined, barely the size of a typewriter, with 3 rotors gleaming dully in the lamplight. For 2 years, he and his team had been fighting a ghost. Every day, thousands of German messages flooded across Europe and the Atlantic, encrypted by machines just like this one. Every day, Allied ships burned and sank because no one could read the warnings hidden in those transmissions. The Enigma was supposed to be unbreakable. The Germans believed it with religious certainty. With 159 quintillion possible settings, more combinations than there were seconds since the birth of the universe, no human mind, no matter how brilliant, could crack it in time to save lives. But Turing wasn't using his mind alone. In the next room, a machine called the bomb hummed and clicked, 8 tons of rotating drums and electrical switches designed to think faster than any human ever could. It was the world's first true computing machine, built to fight another machine. Every night, Turing's team fed it intercepts, fragments of German naval traffic, weather reports, convoy coordinates, and the bomb tore through millions of possible rotor settings, searching for patterns, for mistakes, for anything human hidden in the mechanical perfection. They called themselves Codebreakers, but the truth was darker than that. They were hunters, stalking an invisible enemy through forests of numbers, knowing that every hour of delay meant more men drowning in burning oil. The intelligence chiefs in London had given the operation at Bletchley Park a classification level above top secret. Only 37 people in the entire British government knew the full scope of what was happening in those shabby wooden huts surrounded by barbed wire. Winston Churchill himself had visited in September 1940, walking through the rooms where young mathematicians and linguists worked 20-hour shifts, their eyes bloodshot, their fingers stained with carbon paper. He'd looked at Turing's machines and said nothing for a long time. Then he'd turned to the director and spoken 5 words. Give them everything they need. By the spring of 1941, Bletchley Park had become a factory of secrets. 4,000 people worked in shifts around the clock, intercepting thousands of German messages every day. Radio operators in stations across Britain picked signals from the air like fishermen pulling nets from the sea. The encrypted texts came to Bletchley by motorcycle courier, sometimes still warm from the teleprinter. In Hut 6, teams attacked the Luftwaffe and Army codes. In Hut 8, Turing's naval section fought the deadliest cipher of all, the Atlantic U-boat network that was slowly strangling Britain into submission. Every message they broke saved lives. Every message they missed meant ships went down in the dark, their crews never knowing that rescue was just beyond the horizon. But the Germans were not fools. Every few weeks they changed something. New rotor settings, new codebooks, new procedures. On May 1, 1941, the Kriegsmarine had introduced a 4th rotor to their naval Enigma machines, instantly multiplying the possible combinations by another factor of 26. The bomb machines had gone blind overnight. For 8 days, Bletchley Park could not read a single U-boat message. In those 8 days, 32 Allied merchant ships were torpedoed in the North Atlantic. Over 400 sailors died. Turing barely slept. He knew the math better than anyone. If they couldn't break the four-rotor Enigma soon, Britain would lose the Battle of the Atlantic. And if Britain lost the Atlantic, the war was over. Then came the capture of U-110. The Enigma machine now sitting on Turing's desk was a four-rotor model, the first the Allies had ever recovered intact. With it came the May codebooks, the rotor wiring diagrams, everything needed to rebuild the labyrinth from the inside. For the first time in weeks, Turing felt something close to hope. His team worked through the night, feeding the new intelligence into the bombs, recalibrating the drums, testing settings, and by dawn they had broken that day's naval cipher. By noon, they were reading German U-boat positions in near real time. But as Turing studied the decrypted messages coming through, he noticed something that made his blood turn cold. Buried in a routine weather report from U-556, there was a single line that didn't belong. A reference to a meeting, a location in the mid-Atlantic, and a date, May 24, 1941, 15 days from now. The message was incomplete, corrupted by transmission errors, but the words that came through were clear enough. Bismarck, intercept point. Convoy HX-129. Turing looked up at the map on the wall, at the pins marking known U-boat positions, at the red lines tracing convoy routes. HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, was escorting HX-129, and somewhere out there in the fog and the freezing water, the German battleship Bismarck, the most powerful warship ever built, was hunting. He reached for the telephone to call the Admiralty. His hand stopped halfway, because in that moment, staring at the decrypted message, Alan Turing realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If he told the Admiralty everything they'd learned, if he warned them about the Bismarck's exact plans, the Germans would know their codes were broken. They would change everything. The Enigma intelligence, the source that could win the war, would die overnight. But if he said nothing, Hood would sail straight into an ambush. 1,400 men, gone. The telephone sat silent on the desk. Outside, the dawn was breaking over Bletchley Park. Somewhere in the Atlantic, ships were moving toward their fate. And in a wooden hut in the English countryside, a mathematician held the power to save them or damn them, and no equation in the world could tell him which choice was right. May 24, 1941. Denmark Strait, North Atlantic. The Hood went down in 4 minutes. One salvo from Bismarck's 15-inch guns struck her magazine at 0600 hours, and the largest warship in the British fleet simply exploded. Of the 1,418 men aboard, 3 survived. The shock wave was felt in Scapa Flow, 200 miles away. The shock in London was even greater. Churchill demanded answers. The Admiralty demanded answers. How had Bismarck found Hood so easily in the vastness of the Atlantic? How had German naval intelligence outmaneuvered every British precaution? In Hut 8, Alan Turing said nothing. He'd made his choice 2 weeks earlier, and now he had to live with it. He had warned the Admiralty that Bismarck was at sea. He had given them a general area to search. But he had not told them about the intercept point. He had not revealed how much Bletchley Park really knew. Because if he had, if the Germans realized their codes were broken, the war would turn. Every convoy route would be exposed, every troop movement compromised. The invasion of Europe, still years away, would become impossible. So Hood had died, and Turing had let it happen. He told himself it was the mathematics of war, one ship against thousands, 1,400 men against millions. But mathematics didn't scream when it burned. Numbers didn't drown in oil-slicked water clawing for the surface. He'd been trained to solve problems, to break codes, to think clearly. No one had trained him to play God. But the war didn't stop for guilt. 3 days after Hood sank, Bletchley Park broke a new Bismarck transmission. The battleship had been damaged in the fight and was limping toward the French coast for repairs. Turing's team tracked every message, plotted every course change, until they had Bismarck's exact position and destination. This time, Turing gave the Admiralty everything. Not because it was tactically sound, not because the math supported it, but because he couldn't carry the weight of another choice like the last one. On May 27, 1941, aircraft from HMS Ark Royal torpedoed Bismarck's rudder, leaving her steaming in circles, helpless. British battleships arrived at dawn and pounded her to scrap metal in 90 minutes. Of her crew of 2,200 men, 114 survived. The Royal Navy called it revenge for Hood. Churchill called it justice. Turing called it nothing at all, because he knew the truth. Bismarck hadn't been sunk by superior tactics or brave pilots. She'd been sunk by a wooden box pulled from the North Atlantic, by rotating drums in a machine that thought in numbers, by a secret so valuable that men had to die to protect it. The intelligence from Bletchley Park became the Allies' most powerful weapon. By 1942, they were reading up to 4,000 German messages every day. U-boat positions, supply routes, troop deployments. The invasion of North Africa succeeded partly because Rommel's supply convoys were intercepted based on decrypted orders. The D-Day landings succeeded partly because Bletchley convinced Hitler the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Historians would later estimate that the code-breaking effort shortened the war by at least 2 years and saved 14 million lives. But it came at a cost that no history book would fully record. Because breaking the Enigma wasn't just about reading messages. It was about deciding what to do with what you read. If Bletchley warned about every U-boat attack, every bombing raid, every ambush, the Germans would realize their codes were compromised. So British intelligence officers had to make choices. Which convoys to save, which cities to warn, which soldiers to let die so that the secret remained hidden. They developed a formula. For every 3 warnings they acted on, they ignored 2. They let bombers through, they let U-boats strike. They sacrificed pieces to protect the Queen. There were nights when Turing would stand outside Hut Gate, smoking cigarettes he didn't really want, watching the searchlights sweep the sky over London, 40 miles south. He'd hear the air raid sirens and know that somewhere in the stacks of decrypted messages, there had probably been a warning. And somewhere in the chain of command, someone had decided that acting on it would be too revealing. He wondered if the people dying in those raids would understand. He wondered if he understood himself. The Enigma machines never knew they were beaten. The Germans used them until the last day of the war, trusting absolutely in their mathematical perfection. Even after Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Enigma secret remained classified. The British government kept every detail locked away for 30 years. They gave the captured machines to former colonies, telling them the codes were unbreakable, then continued reading their traffic. Alan Turing received no public recognition for his work. He returned to academic life, developed the theoretical foundations for modern computing, and was prosecuted in 1952 for homosexuality. He died in 1954 at age 41 of cyanide poisoning that was ruled a suicide. Decades later, when the files were finally declassified, historians would argue about whether the choices made at Bletchley Park were justified, whether letting some die to save more was morally defensible, whether men like Turing were heroes or something more complicated than that. But the people arguing had never sat in a cold wooden hut at 4 in the morning holding a decoded message that meant life or death, knowing that whatever choice they made, they'd have to live with the weight of it forever.
The Enigma War wasn't won by courage or firepower. It was won by mathematics and secrecy and the terrible burden of knowing too much. It was won in silence, by people whose names stayed hidden long after the battles were over. And the real cost wasn't counted in ships or planes or cities, but in the souls of the men and women who had to decide, again and again, what truth was worth and what lives could be spent to keep it hidden. In the end, Bletchley Park proved something the world hadn't fully understood before, that information could be a weapon as devastating as any bomb, and that the people who wielded it carried wounds no metal could recognize. The Codebreakers won the war, but they lost something else in the process, something that numbers couldn't calculate and machines couldn't decode, the simple certainty that doing the right thing meant everyone got to live.